Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a genuinely fascinating journey. We're going to explore the evolution of Chicano literature. And honestly, this isn't just your standard timeline of books being published. It's a profound, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately triumphant story about a culture's fight against historical erasure. We're going to look at how this vibrant literary tradition was just ignored for decades, how its core characteristics evolved from these really deep oral roots into modern written works, and how a whole new generation of scholars had to essentially step up and reclaim their own voices to prove they had been speaking all along. So I want you to think about this question for a second. What actually happens when a culture's history is completely left out of the books? I mean, really imagine it. You're growing up, you go to school, you hit the local library, and nothing. You realize that absolutely none of the stories on the shelves reflect your family, your community, or your heritage. It's this profound kind of isolation, right? When mainstream history just skips over you, it's incredibly easy to feel like you and your people are simply invisible. And you know that feeling of invisibility? It was captured perfectly by the brilliant Chicano author Tomas Rivera. Back in 1976, he wrote these incredibly powerful words. At 12, I looked for books by my people and found very few. Very few accounts, in fact, existed. Just think about the weight of that for a moment. At 12 years old, which is literally the time when kids are usually finding their literary heroes, right? Rivera was met with total silence. This moment of childhood isolation beautifully and tragically sets the stage for the entire story we're unpacking today. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we kick off Part 1, Lost and Speechless. A defining characteristic of really early Chicano literature was this overwhelming sensation of being lost. I mean, these raiders were trying to navigate a world that had completely scrubbed their literary history from the record. Rivera actually channeled that exact feeling into his groundbreaking 1971 novel, And y no se lo tragó la tierra, which translates to And the Earth Did Not Part. The young hero of this novel looks back on a lost year and finds himself literally at a loss for words. And this wasn't just some clever plot point. It was a really powerful metaphor for the life of migrant workers and, by extension, all Chicanos at the time. The whole central theme here is that ultimate search for identity when you feel lost and completely speechless in America. But here's where the story takes a turn. The books might have been missing from the library, but the culture itself, definitely not silent. Rivera recalls feeling engulfed with alegría, this profound, overwhelming joy, when he finally heard a local itinerant poet named Bartolo. So Bartolo wandered both sides of the border just selling his oral poetry. For Rivera, this was an absolute revelation. It proved that a shared cultural history, this vibrant living network of stories and human connections, totally existed. It just wasn't written down in the mainstream textbooks yet. Moving right along to Part 2, the myth of silence. So why couldn't a young Tomas Rivera find any books? Well, for decades, the academic establishment pushed this massive myth. They characterized people of Mexican descent in the U.S. as a voiceless, expressionless minority, basically claiming they were largely incapable of reading or writing. Crazy, right? Because the reality was totally different. There was a massive, incredibly rich, and completely undiscovered tradition of both oral and written literary works out there. They weren't voiceless at all. The mainstream historians simply weren't listening. And look, this wasn't just some obscure fringe opinion. This was literally baked into the curriculum. Listen to this quote from Robert Spiller in 1946. In his widely used Literary History of the United States, he completely dismissed the Spanish civilization of the Pacific coast, calling it too thin and too indolent to resist a speedy English-speaking conquest. Because Spiller's book was a required reference for students of American history, this incredibly dismissive myth was taught to generations of kids as absolute, unquestionable fact. So the crucial point is that this wasn't just a one-off mistake. This was a systematic, coordinated narrative built over an entire century. Back in 1844, Thomas Jefferson Farnham calls them incapable of reading. Flash forward to 1919, Robert Ernest Cowan claims they had no particular education. And get this, he said that while simultaneously cataloging their written books. I mean, you can't make this up. And as late as 1949, Carrie McWilliams is still labeling them an anonymous, voiceless minority. Established academics just continuously, relentlessly reinforced this stereotype of an illiterate culture. Which brings us to Part 3, before the year 1848. To actually dismantle this myth, modern scholars had to look way past the official timelines. Often, the year 1848, which was the end of the Mexican-American War and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, is treated as the hard start of Mexican-American history. But in a literary context, 1848 is just a capricious chronological device. Honestly, it's just an arbitrary political line drawn on a map. If you only look at literature created after 1848, you completely ignore the deep human experiences, the archetypal myths, and the rich oral traditions that existed way before that border shifted. You essentially blind yourself to the deep pre-Chicano roots. Because, let's be real, a literary tradition absolutely does not start with the political conquest. For instance, the play Los Comanches originated around 1780. The literature, the folklore, the human sentiments, they were flowing constantly. By the 1850s, right on the heels of the conquests of Texas and the Southwest, early written Chicano traditions were already firmly, undeniably established. The literature was always there. It endured and actually thrived right through all that immense political upheaval. And the only reason we know this today is because modern scholars are essentially acting as literary archaeologists. Scholars like Gennaro Padilla have dug deep back into the archives to rescue these early Chicano and Chicano autobiographies. They're finally doing the heavy lifting that earlier historians completely neglected, documenting the actual lives, the real experiences, and the written works of these early pioneers. It proves definitively that, yes, a written tradition was there all along. Let's shift gears to part 4, rescuing the oral tradition. And this brilliantly illustrates a key piece of the puzzle. Because before modern scholars could uncover those written works, someone had to realize that the massive, living oral tradition was at serious risk of just disappearing. Early on, it was the folklorists who stepped up to the plate. You had Aurelio M. Espinosa studying regional plays back in 1907, Arthur Campa publishing bibliographies in 1930, José Manuel Espinosa meticulously collecting 114 regional folktales in 1937, followed by Juan B. Rael in 1957. These absolute pioneers mapped out the oral traditions, making sure that the foundational stories of the culture survived by getting them down on paper. Eventually, though, this monumental task of preservation and research outgrew individuals. It required serious institutional backing. Institutes like the Julian Samore Research Institute at Michigan State University became absolutely vital. They provided the framework, the funding, and the platforms to generate and transmit this knowledge. They were critical in bringing these historically marginalized voices directly into the mainstream academic spotlight. Which perfectly sets up part 5, writing their own history. This brings us into the modern era, in a massive, massive shift in how Chicano literature is conceived today. It's the move from being the passive subjects of history to becoming the authors of it. The late 1950s was a true turning point. In 1959, José Antonio Villarreal published Pocho, which a lot of critics consider to be the first modern Chicano novel. And right around that same time, you start seeing the first brief literary histories in Spanish being published. This whole era really catalyzed the modern realization that Chicano letters needed to be formally and rigorously documented, but by the community itself. Let's move to and see how this builds into a true legacy. You can see this systemic reclamation in 3 very distinct steps. Step 1, as we discussed, they were excluded from mainstream American literary histories, so they adapt. Step 2, Chicanos started entering universities specifically to train as scholars and literary historians. And then step 3, they began producing comprehensive literary histories themselves. Actually, a lot of these started as doctoral dissertations in the 1970s. They literally built the academic foundation from the ground up. And that hard-fought academic foundation leads directly to vital works like Luis Leal's Chicano Literary History, Origin and Development. Documents like this, they represent the ultimate victory. It's the direct result of Chicano scholars rigorously analyzing, documenting, and validating their own heritage. They proved, once and for all, that the literature wasn't missing, it simply required historians who knew how and where to look. Which leaves us with a fascinating final thought for today. If an entire, vibrant literary history could be overlooked or even deliberately ignored by mainstream academia for over a century, what other rich cultural histories might be hiding in plain sight? What other voices are out there right now, just waiting for their own scholars to finally document them? It's something to think about. Keep exploring, keep questioning those official narratives, and I will see you in the next explainer.